Hello, everyone, and welcome, bienvenue, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Cheyenne Chert, and I'm the Executive Director of Besa Global, a social enterprise who works on conflict and corruption issues. We have an amazing 275 people registered today from South Africa to Canada to Uzbekistan and Nigeria. And that number is a testament to just how important this conversation is to have, particularly today. And I would argue that bringing people together today to discuss the topic of gender and corruption is even more important now than it was even just a year ago. And I say that because with the American administration stepping away from the issue of gender equality, they haven't just neutrally backed away, but they've started to actively work to roll back so many of the advances that we have seen in recent years. So for those of us who can speak up and keep this critical issue alive, it behooves us to do so. And it's not just that. It was the Biden administration that was responsible for such a large amount of funding within the innovation in anti-corruption space. And so with their withdrawal from supporting innovation in anti-corruption, as well as anti-corruption on its own, we really run the risk of stalling in our work and the really important work that is being done, and not only to do it, but also to do it more, better, faster. So the purpose of today is to bring together some of the latest, most innovative work on gender and corruption, and specifically gender and social norms and corruption, to learn together, but also to share and engage. So our agenda today, I will start off with covering just a few critical concepts just to ensure that we have some common understanding. And from there, Karen and Isaac will dive into what role gender norms play in corruption, with Karen looking at it from the vulnerabilities and resistance or reporting corruption perspective, and Isaac looking at it more from the perspective of perpetrators of corrupt acts. At which point, we'll have the opportunity to break into two different discussion groups, and you can choose the group that you'd like to join, the group with Karen or the group with Isaac. And during the conversation, you can actually move between groups if you'd like. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll come back all together to talk with Diana about how to identify how social and gender norms interact. We'll have a short question and answer period after that, and then we'll actually go just for a short break so everybody can take a minute to step away from the screen and then come back. At which point, we'll have covered what is the relationship between gender norms and corruption? How do you identify it? So then, of course, we have to move to how do you address the influence of gender norms on corruption? We'll have the opportunity again to break into two different discussion groups. Again, you choose your discussion group where we can talk with Paul and Ortron about their different perspectives. And then we'll close up. Before we dive in, I think we have to take an opportunity to thank the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, because none of this would have been possible without their financial support. And they've been true partners in our work over the last 2 years looking at gender norms and corruption. And with that, I'll ask Alex to give just a few words around some of the technical aspects of this webinar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Behenna from Besa Global, and I'll be giving a quick overview now of how things will run on Zoom during today's session so that you can fully participate and get the most out of this webinar. So your microphone and camera are turned off by default. This helps reduce background noise and distractions. You'll still be able to participate through our interactive tools. If you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can type your question at any time, and our team will review them throughout the session. Some may be answered live, while others may receive written responses. From time to time, a poll may appear on your screen. You can click your preferred option and submit your response. Results may be shared live with the audience. You can engage using reactions, such as a thumbs up or applause, by clicking the heart icon at the bottom of your screen. These small gestures help our speakers feel your energy, even virtually. Later in the session, you'll have the opportunity to join breakout discussion rooms based on specific discussion topics. When the time comes, you'll see a list of available rooms and can choose the one that interests you most. Once inside, you'll be able to turn on your microphone and camera, interact freely with others, and move between rooms if you wish. And finally, as mentioned earlier, we're pleased to offer live French interpretation. To access it, click the interpretation icon, a globe symbol, at the bottom of your Zoom window and select French. If you don't see the icon, please click More. You can also choose to mute or keep the original audio if you prefer to hear both languages. And that's the quick Zoom overview. I'll now hand it back to Cheyenne to continue.
Okay, so if I can ask everybody who's joined us to go to the chat and answer this question. Does your organization directly work on changing gender norms related to corruption? So I'll say that again. In the chat, if you could answer the question, does your organization directly work on changing gender norms related to corruption? Oh, super interesting. We have a good chunk of no's, but we also have some not sure's, and we have some yeses. So that gives us a nice spectrum of experience. For those who do work on gender norms, I'm going to just say a few words around what the concepts are around social norms and gender norms. Don't worry, it's only 3 minutes. And for those of you who are new to the topic, again, I'm just going to give a quick set of basics so that we have a common foundation and our speakers can dive right into their research. So any good social norm conversation has to start with behaviors because social norms drive behaviors, but they are not the same thing. A behavior is an action. It's a thing we do. So brushing your teeth, tying your shoelaces, those are both behaviors. Similarly, a teacher demanding a bribe in order for a student to get their report card, or a hiring manager requiring sex to secure a job, those are also behaviors. And the vast majority of anti-corruption efforts also require people to take action. So a lot of anti-corruption is actually behavioral as well. Think about calling a government hotline to report corruption. That's a behavior. So what influences how we behave? Well, many, many things interact to influence how we behave. Laws, procedures, attitudes, knowledge, as well as social norms. What influences behavior? So many things influence behavior, and one of which are social norms. And social norms are the mutual expectations held within a group about the appropriate and typical way to behave in a particular situation. Now, it's important to realize they're not attitudes, they're not synonymous with culture, and they're not just practices commonly done. They are mutual expectations. And when there is a social norm that is driving behavior, they can be more powerful than your individual attitude or even the laws and rules that exist in that context. And what that means is when a social norm exists, it can make you do things you don't agree with or that you know are breaking the rules. And the research from other fields finds that if there is a norm behind the behavior, you will not be able to achieve sustainable behavior change if you only direct your programming on the behavior. You have to also seek to change the social norm. So what are these mutual expectations? They're made up of two different beliefs. They're the beliefs about what others do and the beliefs about what others think we should do. And these beliefs are not just anybody's beliefs. They're the beliefs of the people in your group. And it's that group that helps create the social norm and maintain the social norm. And they do that through positive and negative rewards or punishments for your behavior. So when you comply with the social norm, you are met with a greater sense of belonging, which could be as simple as a nod of acknowledgement. being included in activities. It could feel an increased sense of respect. But when you do not comply with the mutual expectation of the group, you will be negatively punished. And those punishments typically revolve around relationships or reputation. And that can be gossiping. It can be being excluded from functions, events, even as small as a lunch. And in a professional environment, it can also include being demoted or having professional negative consequences. So it's this group that creates and maintains the expectations. The group, you might know them. They might be all people you have personal relationships with. So your football team, people in your office, your extended family. But it can also be those you share an identity with, but you don't actually know personally. So it could be all the fans of a football club. It could be the alumni of a university, and it could be all women. So what this means is that we are all part of multiple groups at the same time, which means we're all experiencing multiple norms at the same time. You might be a mother, you might be a lawyer, you might be a member of the parent council of your kid's school. Each of those groups will have mutual expectations about the right way to behave. And this means that you might experience different pressures because sometimes those norms can align. So the groups all expect the same thing. And when that happens, it can really strengthen the pressure behind that particular behavior. But it can also be, when you're a member of multiple groups, that those norms contradict. Now, some literature says that when there's a contradiction, it's the group that has most salience or most relevance to the particular context. So that would mean if you're in a work environment, your work group norm would be more important than, say, maybe your religious community norm. But we found it's not quite so straightforward in our work. And what we found is that people, when they are experiencing contradicting norms from two different groups, they juggle and adapt and try and meet both norms in just different ways. And with that very brief introduction, I would like to introduce our first speaker. And that's to talk about how gender norms impact behavior. So with that, Karen Pfeiffer speaking on some of her latest work from the Asia Pacific on how gender norms make women vulnerable to corruption and reduce willingness to report. I'll just say that Karen's portfolio of research largely focuses on the impacts of corruption on public policy processes and the consequences of anti-corruption policies. Karen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cheyenne. Just sharing my presentation now. Thanks to the organizers for putting together this event. I think Cheyenne laid out clearly why this is so important right now. As she mentioned, I'm going to take my time to share some of the key insights that were taken from my research on this relationship between gender norms, so those mutual expectations that people have, largely my research looked at of women in Asia Pacific and how that interacts with their experiences with the state, their vulnerability to corruption, and their willingness to report corruption or to hold public officials accountable. Just to give some context, the study really came out of observing that there was this growing recognition that corruption is gendered internationally. This occurred really, I saw it most in international policy circles, in the scholarship on corruption. And however, the gender corruption nexus in Asia and Pacific was largely underexplored or not explored with sort of the contemporary frameworks that I hope you'll find today are really valuable to look through these lenses of thinking about it through a social norms perspective. For this study, I worked really closely with Transparency International chapters in 4 different countries, and we co-designed focus group studies in each of these countries. Altogether, there were 139 participants in these focus groups in Cambodia, Fiji, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. And one of the key aims of the study was to understand how gender shapes vulnerability to corruption, so grassroots corruption, as well as willingness to take action or to report about those experiences. So I've outlined just some of the key findings to get to the heart of the study. And then I'll talk about what I think this means for practice. How do we address these things? But just to say that it was a universal observation across the focus groups. What came up time and again were these mutual expectations, these social norms we hold about gender especially, and about corruption in this interaction. So the gender norms were really at the heart of the findings of this study. One of the key themes across focus groups was that this idea that grassroots corruption, so when I say grassroots corruption, it's a type of corruption that ordinary people would largely be targeted with and for, that this is inherently gendered. And one of the primary reasons or examples that was mentioned in our focus groups was the fact that women are far more likely asked for sexual benefit instead of a monetary bribe than men are. So this was reported in every single country's focus groups. And in these discussions, what came up time and again was this idea that gender norms promote the objectification of women by men. And this contributes sometimes to situations of sexual coercion that can take the shape of sexual corruption. So when women are asked to engage in a sexual act when they're trying to get something that they're entitled to from the state. So that quote from the Indonesian participant to the right kind of exemplifies this idea that in Indonesia, the observation they're making is that regardless of social status, women are objectified. This then has real world consequences on how they experience their interactions with the state and with corruption. Also emphasizes this idea that sexual corruption victims, which are disproportionately women, they often experience an intense sense of shame due to societal expectations of sexual modesty and a range of other issues that contribute to this sense of shame. And this unfortunately also leads to the impunity of perpetrators, this fear of speaking out, of making themselves known as victims of sexual corruption. A second gender norm that was emphasized was something that I've termed feminine passivity, but in different words, using different language across the focus groups. Again, this was a universal finding in all 4 countries. Time and again, focus group participants emphasize the fact that many women and girls are raised to be socially passive in their societies. So they're discouraged from engaging in confrontations, in raising their voices even. And this overall gender norm can really manifest itself when we think about this nexus with corruption in discouraging women from resisting or reporting corruption. As a result, officials, it was argued, often perceive women as an easier target. Men might challenge a request for a bribe, but women maybe will be less likely to because of this overarching gender norm. You could see in the quote on the right, it says this, another quote from one of our participants, that women are found less reporting, less refusing to pay a bribe, largely because they aren't challenging public officials. They aren't expected to. A third dominant gender norm in the findings was this expectation we have that women are to be the primary caregivers of family, local community, extended family. And this one was discussed as leading to their disproportionate contacts with healthcare and education sector. So they're more likely to take the elderly to a doctor's appointment, more likely to take their children to school. And this alone means that they're very likely disproportionately targeted for bribes in those interactions. But even aside from that, there's the added discussion that we had in focus groups about pressure to be a good mother and a good daughter and what that means. And again, to think about what Cheyenne was saying in terms of mutual expectations and shared understandings about what is a good mother or a good daughter. Largely that puts a different pressure on women in these interactions. To be a good mother, a good daughter in the focus groups, it was discussed as being the one who is able to secure those services that the people you're caring for require. So if that means paying a bribe, that puts this added pressure on women to not refuse to pay a bribe, to just pay a bribe in order to get the service. Just using bribery as an example, and also can contribute to making women especially fearful about reporting corruption. Fearful that if I refuse or report corruption, potentially I'm going to be the one that is in part responsible for making sure that my loved one is not getting the care that I am responsible for providing. Those are the 3 gender norms that the research tended to emphasize. And thinking about what does this mean? How do we move forward if we understand the roles that these gender norms in these regions might be playing? And the title here really is the bottom line, which is addressing corruption really means to address these gender norms. The minute that we are recognizing that these specific gender norms might be behind these different patterns of corruption, it means that we need to think about how do we challenge them. And challenging them is really complex and challenging. This is not easy work because these are mutually shared expectations that are emerging from a range of issues within every single context. My research on policy interventions with trying to change norms around corruption, for example, so this is anti-corruption awareness raising, these direct policy messages have been shown to have mixed results in practice, showing it's not so easy to try and change things as we would hope they would. And this suggests to me that potentially a more effective approach, maybe think about this indirectly. So if gender norms like this emerge from instances where there's high levels of gender inequality, then potentially our way to tackle corruption is to tackle gender equality itself. And so this leads me to the bottom line, which I think is what the research altogether shows, is that tackling gender inequality itself is not only just this matter of justice that is useful for its own reasons, but it's also a strategic way to create more effective and sustainable anti-corruption solutions. So this tackling gender norms is not just directly challenging the gender norms themselves, but it's also tackling that overall enabling environment, of which gender inequality is a huge factor. Thanks very much, and I look forward to talking about everything in the breakout groups.
Thanks so much, Karen. Those are really interesting points, and I just want to underline this connection you made between shame and the continuing of impunity. That's really important for us to be thinking about, because impunity is a major issue in so many of the contexts that we work. Next, I'd like to introduce Isaac Ortagan, and his presentation brings us into the African continent, and specifically looking at a project that we did together on how gender and social norms influence Nigerian health workers to participate in corruption. And this changes our focus away from women being vulnerable to corruption to looking at the impact of norms on the perpetrators of corruption. Isaac is a research advisor at the Policy Innovation Center in Nigeria and a data analyst with a specialization in health and education. And with that, over to you, Isaac.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne, and hello, everyone. Good to be here. So in my time in the work, I will be discussing some findings from the work we did, of course, with Cheyenne and the team, around understanding the multiple social norms behind informal payments in the Nigerian primary healthcare sector. For the purpose of this work, we did work in 3 Nigerian states, conducted about 156 interviews, and interviewed close to 366 participants doing FGDs, IDIs, and KIIs. And this stemmed out of the fact that informal payments in the Nigerian healthcare sector, primarily the primary healthcare sector, is widespread, and then health workers in these PHCs often solicit or accept extra payment for services. And some of these services are either for drugs, medications, or for vaccines. And like I mentioned, our study location was primarily because we're also looking at some intersectional factors around faith and religion. So we selected those locations based on data available for those states. What were some of the things we were finding? As regarding gender, we began to see how gender and social norms shapes who pays, who benefits, and who resists. Who pays these extra charges or payments, who benefits from this payment, and who resists, right? And then in talking about who pays, it was very clear that some service users, especially women, may feel less able to challenge the health workers asking for these payments. And then it's difficult for them to resist, paying these charges because they are women and they have less agency to stand their ground and say, oh no, I wouldn't pay this, compared to men who could just come and throw tantrums in the health facility, and then at the end of the day, they might, go off not paying this, paying these extra charges. So the report really noted that female service users were aware that these payments were wrong, but they still felt the need to pay, to get these access to services. Now, who benefits? Health workers generally benefit from the normalization of this social expectation and the social expectation that you have to pay extra charges when you go to receive services in the health facility. And then most times they encourage this payment. And just like Cheyenne had mentioned in the introduction, for health workers who do not adhere to this norm of receiving this payment, they often face some level of sanction, some of which includes sidelining them in the health facility, or even introducing them, or even transferring them far away from the health facility. And it's also important to note that health workers, both male and female, typically ask for this informal payment, or which is like a descriptive norm, or they also experience some level of social pressure to collect this payment, and they believe that either colleagues or supervisors expect them to solicit or receive this kind of payment. However, it is noteworthy that the community places an indirect pressure on these health workers to receive these informal payments. Now, health workers are members of the community, and so they are workers in the communities. And there are these demands on trying to meet the community needs in maybe contributing for a family function or meeting the need of a family member who really does not have a job and needs their money. So that places an indirect pressure on the health workers to begin to, ask for this informal payment, especially where their salaries are really not enough to meet the needs for which the community members or their family members are putting pressure on them for. However, these pressures override the health workers' attitude. So, for example, although some people view informal payment as inappropriate, the female health workers, even more than male workers, did believe that most believe that these charges are very inappropriate, and so they really do not subscribe to it. However, it's also worthy to note that because of the extra pressure on men to meet the family demands and try to, meet the needs of their family, then that places an extra pressure on them to request or receive these unauthorized charges. So there were a lot of intersections between culture, and especially within the facility and the community, and then the gender norms. So the gender norms inside the facility, the report pointed out to the unspoken facility norms. For example, being a good health worker means that you're delivering services without extra reward, but at the same time, the prevailing norm is to collect payments, and so female health workers may feel the tension more acutely, and the expectation of care and services which is expected of a woman. And then there's also that point of we need to gather extra payment to meet the needs of our family. So you see that as women, they face the extra dilemma of trying to be good, show care, and then trying to meet the demands of their family. Also, especially because There's also the new, I wouldn't call it new, but the demand on women to begin to meet the needs of their family as well, and not just place all of those responsibility on the men. So you see female health workers trying so hard to also meet the needs of their families by receiving or requesting for these informal charges. So just to summarize, and then I'm sure we'll have a lot of time to talk about this in the breakout. One, informal payment in the health sector is normalized through social norms that is not just driven by material shortages. And secondly, health workers operate in a normative context where asking for or receiving this informal payment is expected, and it's often reinforced by peer culture, institutional silence, and gender role expectations, like I mentioned earlier. Thirdly, and gender norms matter, and this is because female health workers may view such payments as inappropriate, and they face a different kind of pressure to, receive these charges, and they may be less likely to challenge the norm. And then finally, we had also mentioned that some form of effective anti-corruption efforts must go beyond just engaging the health workers, but must also address the social norms that drive this receiving or asking for these informal charges in the health commodities. Thank you very much. And over to you, Shayan.
Super. Thank you, Isaac. And thank you for giving us such a good example of when individual attitudes differ from the social norms, and the social norms win and drive the behavior to healthcare workers then soliciting bribes because the social norm is there, even though their individual attitudes suggest that it's not what they would like to do. So at this juncture, we're going to move into two small groups to discuss. You can choose what group you'd like to go in. There will be a pop-up function on your screen. One group will be with Karen and one group will be with Isaac, and we'll be able to engage with question and answer and some conversation in the small group for approximately 15 minutes. Unfortunately, for our French-speaking colleagues, the Zoom functionality does not allow us to bring simultaneous translation into the small group room. So I'm afraid that we won't have translation for the discussions, but we will be back in 15 minutes, and Diana will be picking up at that point, talking about how we identify gender and social norms and how they interact with corruption. So with that, and I'll also just mention that you can move between rooms. So you can join one room, ask your question, and pop to the other room if you have a question for our other panelist as well. So I believe we'll have a pop-up in front of your screen that will give you the option to pick your breakout room. Hello, everyone. I think we're all back. I hope you had a good discussion. If I could ask you to take a minute and reflect on the discussion or the presentations, and put in the chat one important takeaway or one question that you still want to think about. So if I can ask everyone to go to the chat and just pop in one takeaway that you have from the discussion that you were part of or from one of the presentations. We're going to move into the direction of how to create change. Before we get to the how to create change presentations, which Paul and Ortran are all keyed up to do, first we're going to move to our next speaker, which is Diana Chigas. And she will be talking about how one assesses or identifies how gender norms interact with social norms to influence corrupt behaviors. Diana is the co-director of the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy Program, which is one of Besa Global's flagship programs. And her presentation is based on two studies that we've conducted, one in Madagascar and one with Isaac's organization in Nigeria. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Diana.
Hi, everybody. Again, I am the methodology interlude here between the substantive discussions of gender norms, and I think we'll move from talking about gender norms and how they affect corruption, and I think after me will be really now what do we do about it? But I will share some lessons from these two projects that Cheyenne mentioned on how methodological lessons about how to assess the intersections between gender norms and social norms and how they affect corruption. So again, just a couple of notes on where the lessons come from. As Cheyenne said, it's from work with PIC, where Isaac is, and from with Transparency International Initiative Madagascar. We partnered with them in sequence to develop and pilot a methodology for exploring the interaction of multiple norms, including gender norms, and their effect on corrupt behaviors. And he said we did that because we saw and we know methodologies for identifying social norms were fairly well developed. And we and others, many of you in this Zoom meeting, had done analyses of social norms driving corrupt behaviors in other contexts. And work existed, especially in other fields, on how to analyze gender norms and break them down. And there was work on gender analysis and mainstreaming. There's a lot of work in that in relation to anti-corruption. But surprisingly, we found very little on how gender norms intersect with the social norms that drive corrupt behaviors. And we found very little on how on gender norms and corruption. So that's what we set out to develop and test a methodology for assessing that. So these are the lessons. In trying to make this methodology robust but simple enough to be doable, we started with the premise of adapting the existing social norms identification methodologies to explore intersections. We used a qualitative methodology, the vignette-based method, where for those of you who don't know it, we create a hypothetical story about a fictional character in a locally relevant and resonant context, making decisions about how to behave, for example, whether or not to solicit an informal payment. Then we ask questions about the behavior and their motivations for it in order to elicit the components of a social norm. That would be the main character's beliefs of what is typical behavior in that situation, their beliefs about what others would expect them to do, the rewards and punishments for engaging or not engaging in the behavior, and of course, which group holds those expectations and sort of exerts the pressure on them. And we did the vignettes because corruption is such a sensitive topic. The vignettes gives a little bit of distance and perhaps encourages people and gives them some safety to answer more honestly in that context. So it was fairly straightforward to integrate general norms interactions into this process. We simply added a variation to the basic story. We changed the gender, for example, of the main character, let's say a doctor, from a male to a female. And you can see an example here from Nigeria on the slide. In the second variation, we changed the gender of the counterpart in the corrupt transaction. So, for example, the patient being asked to pay the doctor's request for payment, changed them from a woman to a man. And then we asked how things would be different for them. Would they behave differently? Would they have different expectations along all the elements of a social norm? We learned quite quickly that you need to be very clear on what you want to explore in relation to gender norm influence, because you can really only change the story twice. Beyond that, the interview or focus group process becomes too long, so you can't finish your inquiry. Or it becomes confusing for the participants. They have a hard time following the story and therefore answering the questions adequately. Which brings me to the second lesson, in sense, which Cheyenne had emphasized at the very beginning. It's why it was important, as with all social norms, to be clear first on what behavior you're focusing on and who does it before you start thinking about norms at all. A doctor's request for payment is different behavior from the patient's paying it or offering some sort of payment. And the way that gender norms will affect whether, when, and how doctors solicit bribes will be different from how they will affect patients who are offering or being asked to pay a bribe. So the social norms inquiry will be different with doctors than it will be with patients, obviously. And so clarity on who you're focusing on and what they are doing will help make sure that you're collecting the right information, and it will be useful for your programming. So a third lesson had to do with going beyond looking at differences in behavior. A lot of when we were looking at the literature on gender and corruption, a lot focuses on differences in attitudes between men and women, differences in behavior. For example, the frequency with which men or women engage in paying bribes or asking for bribes, etc. And this is really important information, and we don't collect it enough. We don't disaggregate enough at all. But it's the tip of the iceberg for exploring social norms. And why? There are three big reasons for me, as we learn from the reflections on our team. One is that gender differences in behavior may exist for a number of reasons, some of which may be completely unrelated to gender norms. For example, a man may offer a bribe to a health worker to skip to the front of the line at the hospital for very practical reasons. He's worried that the medicines will run out before he can get to the top of the head of the line with his sick child, or he needs to get back to a job that he can't afford to lose, and he doesn't have very much time off. So those are practical reasons, but there also may be reasons related to gender norms. So for example, he may be mocked or criticized as not being resourceful enough or aggressive enough to have gotten treated quickly by his colleagues at work or by men in the community, for example. So that's one reason. A second reason is that there are several possible gender norms that may be driving a single behavior. So for female patients, gender norms that they should be nice and not challenge or confront people, and they should be, may drive their reluctance to resist health workers' requests for payments. And that's reinforced by another gender norm that they should do whatever it takes to fulfill their home family responsibilities or be a good mother or daughter, as Karen said in her presentation. Even if that means giving a bribe, that may override it because that's so important. And finally, sometimes, as we found in Nigeria, not so much in Madagascar, actually, but in Nigeria, there may be no perceived difference in the frequency, but gender norms can still create subtle differences in how the behavior is carried out or justified. So in the inquiry about the intersections, it's really important to go beyond simply identifying what is different, to understand why and how it's different and where gender expectations play a role and how. And this is how I think helped us understand whether and what gender norms, as well as what non-normative factors were causing some of these differences and how. And of course, it's important, I think I don't need to say this, everybody knows this, it's important not to forget that both women and men are influenced by gender norms. And the norms are different for each. So you need to analyze both and including all of the elements of the social norms, the gender norms for each of them in those transactions. Finally, or not quite finally, probing for norm conflicts. As Cheyenne mentioned at the beginning, people are members of multiple groups, and they're subject and they're parts to multiple norms at the same times. And as we found, the norms can interact in many ways. Sometimes a gender norm can reinforce a social norm, in supercharging it in some way. So in Nigeria, for example, community-based social pressures on health workers, which apply to everybody as providers, were reinforced for men by gender norms that men should provide for their family, and that they associated their masculinity with that provider for that provider role. Sometimes, though, norms conflict, and often for women, but not only. And when they do, a lot of the social norms literature suggests that one should figure out which norm wins, which prevails. It's stronger or more relevant in the situation, so people will follow that one norm. And this may be the case. and in many situations. But sometimes, as we found in Nigeria, again, a little less so in Madagascar, where one did prevail, but the norms may be equally salient or influential. So in Nigeria, again, where the health workers were expected to be kind, caring, and honest, yet also expected by their colleagues to collect payments and by their community to be providers and to provide generously for them. And so here, as Isaac said, there's a tension or a dilemma that people face. And so you need to probe not only how people behave, but also how they take their decisions, how they justify their behavior in these situations. People are very good at reconciling conflicting expectations with workarounds or moral justifications and rationalizations. So the women subject to this dilemma in our Nigeria study then resolved it by engaging in the behavior, asking for payments much more covertly, for example, at night, and really taking care to justify them as part of their caring duties. The payments, they said, allowed them to cover transport and supplies that they needed to give the servants to patients. So they're being consistent with the gender norm. And that helps you really get a fuller picture of how the gender norms really influence the corrupt behaviors.
Diana, I'm going to need you to
Yep.
got about 15 seconds.
Yeah, my final piece is really just, I can't overemphasize how important it is to resource the assessment effort and train and support data collectors adequately. This process takes more time to collect data, more questions, more people to talk to, more analysis, and it needs investment, it needs expertise, not just training people on research instruments. Otherwise, if they don't have the expertise, they may get good information on attitudes, but miss social norms or surface differences, but not understand the norms behind them. So I will end there and go move to question and answer, and anything else that I've missed, please feel free to ask about it.
Yeah, so if you have a question that you would like to ask, if you want to raise your hand and then we can call on you. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, you can always type it into the Q&A feature. So here's a question for you, Diana. What was the one key finding methodologically and conceptually?
Oh, great question to boil it down. Yeah, I think and I'll take it a little bit kind of in a roundabout way. I think for us, the most surprising norm, given some of the literature and some of the previous research, was really watching how people navigated the conflicting norms. Because I think we expected, and somewhat behaviorally, yes, people asked for informal payments. But really, once we probed, and being able to do that probing allowed us conceptually to say that there's other ways that people actually work with multiple norms than the ones that have been, I think, most talked about in the literature. I'm sure many of you have also seen this as well. So that, I think, from that perspective, was a surprising but also key finding for us in thinking about how the gender norms interact. And I think also looking at the sort of both sides of the transaction, because we looked at patients too. Isaac didn't talk about that very much, but we looked at the patients too, and how I think methodologically, do we look at both? Because we can look at both sides of the transaction and see if you're doing an intervention, how to do that. And again, how to probe for those kinds of gender norms, where in Madagascar, it was so ingrained that people didn't even think about it. So really thinking methodologically about how to bring that out in some of the vignettes, I think, was one of the challenges.
And then Diana, I'm just going to throw one more question. Thank you for that question, Leonard. And I'm going to throw a question at you from Lindy. Conceptually, do you see gender norms as a subset of social norms, noting that you separate these out in your research?
The short answer is yes. I do see them as a subset of social norms. And so that's why when we were actually looking at methodologically looking at the gender norms, one of the things that we made sure to do is actually look at them and look at each component of a social norm in relation to the gender norms. So in some ways, it was one of the social norms, and I think a fairly widespread, I think it's applicable in a widespread way. That applies, that's one of the multiple norms that may influence people.
Okay, if there are some other questions, and we'll make a point of either answering that in writing. At this juncture, we're going to move to just a 3-minute break to give people a chance to stand up, get a glass of water, maybe a quick washroom break, and then we'll dive back in. And I believe we'll have a little countdown clock on the screen that will help you know when we come back. Thank you for the folks who are doing reactions. That's lovely. And so we will be back in, there we go. And it's going down to 3 minutes. Perfect. I'll see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. So far we've talked about the interaction between gender norms and vulnerabilities and resistance to reporting, as well as how gender norms can change the actual corrupt practices themselves. And as we suggested at the beginning, we had all of those conversations so we could move into the so what conversation, the what do we do about it? So we're moving over to our colleague from Uganda, Paul Bukelele, and he's going to talk about the layering of gender norms and social norms to change strategies in anti-corruption programming. Paul's a professor at Makerere University, where one of his research areas is social norms, and he was the methodology lead for the Nigeria study that Isaac presented on. And with that, Paul, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. It is really great to be in this forum. So now that we have an understanding of how social and gender norms, how they influence corruption behavior, what are some of the considerations for social norm change in the anti-corruption space? That is what I will be speaking about. Next slide. So within the field of changing social norms, there are a number of assumptions we do, a number of assumptions we make. Tyler, if we can go to the next slide. And one of the things that are key is that we know that that change is not just about communicating knowledge to people. Knowledge could be an entry point, but knowledge does not change deeply entrenched social norms that drive corrupt behavior, for example. So if you have this assumption that when you change knowledge, it is going to translate into behavior change, when there are very strong social sanctions that are associated with breaking a norm, then you may not get very far. Next slide. And the other bit actually is that the way social norms change is that the change happens when enough people see that enough people are changing. So, for example, public declarations are very important for people to know that their neighbors are changing and it is safe for them to change, that they are not going to suffer backlash, they are not going to be suffering from severe social sanctions, that actually they were thinking that people have not changed, but actually change has started happening, and they also join on board. And on the next slide, the other aspect that you have to pay attention to is that strong norms take more time to achieve. Like Diana and Cheyenne were saying, some norms have severe social sanctions. Those and they are widely shared. Sometimes we call them meta norms, and these will need a critical mass to create change, and they may take a while. but they change. It means that the strategies for social norm change need to take into account the strengths of the norm. And here you need a critical mass. Next slide. So as you are planning your social norm change strategies or gender norm change strategies, you must think of integrating them within the theory of change, within that philosophical understanding of what the problem is and what the solution is. So you have to take into account what is the goal. The goal, for example, is the intervention supposed to stop an old norm? Is it supposed to create a new norm? And how then, what other factors beyond the norms are also driving this change? Should you be thinking about other structural factors that combine with norms? So theory of change becomes very important as you think about norm change. Next slide. And there are a number of strategies that I will be taking you through very briefly that are very important for norm change, including mass media, personalized feedback, group discussions, role models, and social networks. But most importantly, on the next slide, I say that particularly for the laws, it is very important to make sure that until there are social sanctions from the community enforcing the laws, they will not change norms. So in a lot of anti-corruption work, the focus is on strengthening the laws, strengthening formal retribution, but actually the informality is very important. For example, in Bogota, one of the mayors succeeded in changing norms only by making sure that there was social pressure on those who do not adhere to the norm. In others, the law became the new norm, and there were social sanctions from the communities for those who were not adhering to the norm. So if you want the law to work, there must be social sanctions from the community that help in enforcing the law. If that is not the case, there might be challenges. Because in societies, especially in low and middle-income countries, where collectivism is very strong, the laws are, the formal is weaker than the informal. So the informal norms take the day. Next slide. And when it comes to mass media, it is important that mass media is not just speaking about the negative norms, everybody to be aware of them, because it will simply be reinforcing those norms. It should focus on norm change, for example, positive messaging to show the benefits of changing the norm through the various techniques like radio broadcasts, billboards, theater plays, role model approaches, among others. But once it does not focus on changing the norm, then it might simply be reinforcing the negative norm. This is extremely important. Next slide. The other strategy we normally use is what we call personalized normative feedback. And here, providing personalized information about how one performs compared to the peers. So we all belong to networks, we belong to peers. And if you show people or communities how they are performing compared to their peers, that can be an incentive for them to change. So peer-led approaches and role modeling approaches then are extremely important in this case. Next slide. And then it is the other strategies, the group conversations. And the most important thing the unique thing about these conversations is that they should allow critical reflection. They should be able to allow critical reflection, and they should be able to promote organized diffusion to ensure wider reach of information and learning among the target audiences. And as I wind up, next slide. Role models and social networks are extremely important. But as we think about role models and social networks, you have to think about, for example, the gender expectations. You might have to have separate sessions with women and separate sessions with men. Role models that work for men may not be the same role models that work for the women. Like in Nigeria, where I found that direct social pressures on health workers, men and women are different. You must make sure that even as you are role modeling, you take care of the differences in the social expectations based on gender norms. Next slide. And of course, you can mix, changing social norms might mean mixing several strategies, mixing community conversations with personalized feedback, with the laws, among others. So you don't just use one approach, but you use multi-pronged approaches. But by and large, as I wrap up on the next slide, I just want to emphasize the fact that layering is extremely important, because you may not find social norm programs or gender norms programs that stand alone. They might be part of larger programs. So it is important to ensure that as you do the theory of change, there are pathways clearly that are going to help you examine the intersections between social norms and gender norms, intersections, gender expectations that are very important in driving corruption. And ideally, this should come from formative studies. But it is so important for you to ensure that as you are designing these programs, the gender expectations are well spelled out right from the inception or the formative study, through collecting data, through the co-design workshops, in order for you to really be able to make pitch social and gender norm change from an intersectional perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And I just want to reiterate a couple of you made so many good points, but if I could underline the point that you started with, that knowledge change is not enough. You need to layer in many more different change strategies in order to affect social norms. And also, I want to reiterate what you said around that strategies must take into account the strength of the norm, which takes us back to Diana's presentation on you have to identify the specific behavior, the specific norms that are driving that behavior, and the strength, and then tailor your strategy accordingly. So thank you for all of that. Next up, and our final official speaker, is Ortrand Merkel, who will be talking about some of her latest work done with GIZ on where norms fit into the broader gender transformation agenda. Ortrand's research in general specializes in the intersection of gender and corruption, with a particular emphasis on sexual corruption. And with that, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all the previous speakers who already highlighted so many different aspects of this relationship, about vulnerability, about the influence of corrupt behavior, and of course, about what we can do about it. And what I want to do in my 10 minutes now is to bring these threads together a bit and invite us to look at the bigger picture by arguing that understanding gender norms is important, but then thinking about how transforming them or how we can transform them is quite a different question. And I want to encourage us all to think a little bit about that. So there's one message that I would like you to take away from my talk, is that gender transformative anti-corruption work is not about changing women's behavior. It's also not about changing the behavior of individual men, right? It's really about shifting the norms and power structures that make corruption possible in the first place. And if there's one thing that you take away from what I'm saying, I would like it to be this. So let's unpack this a little bit, right? So what do we actually mean when we talk about, gender transformation? And oftentimes when people hear this, they're just thinking about, oh, yes, yet another technical method, yet another checklist that we have to do, another module we have to add, and something that we can't add on to an existing system. But transformation is not an add-on, right? It's really about shifting how we think and think about and understand the problem. And the gender transformative approach starts with a very simple but very powerful assumption that corruption is not gender neutral, and neither are our anti-corruption systems, right? They reflect the same gender norms, the same hierarchies, and the same exclusions that shape society more broadly. So if we want integrity, we have to pay attention to these deeper structures, not only to individual acts. So let me put it differently. Classic anti-corruption approaches often focus on what people do, right? Gender transformative approaches focus more on why they can do it and why others feel unable to challenge it, right? So it's a different way of asking questions. So we ask questions like, who is allowed to challenge authority without being dismissed or punished? Who is socialized to not make a fuss, right? Who is expected to tolerate abuse? Who is considered credible when they speak? Whose silence is just convenient for the system, right? And these questions are very political. And I think especially in our times where we see this backlash against gender, this is even more political and more important, right? Because they reveal whose experiences are treated as legitimate, whose pain is normalized, and whose behavior is excused, right? And I'm sure once you see corruption through this lens, you cannot unsee it, right? Once you're in it, you see it everywhere. As we've heard throughout the session already, norms define what is normal, and corruption thrives in what is normalized. So many of us think of corruption in terms of rules being broken, but really what corruption is very much about norms being followed, right? Norms about loyalty, norms about obedience, norms about masculinity, opportunity, or silence, right? So if thinking of examples, a woman who stays silent in the face of sexual corruption is responding to a norm that tells her she will be blamed, she will be shamed, or she will not be believed if she speaks up. A man who navigates an informal network to get things done is responding to norms that frame these practices as necessary markers of leadership or often even competence, right? So these norms decide what is thinkable, what is tolerable, and what is unmentionable. And very often they make certain forms of corruption seem normal, even when everyone recognizes them as harmful. And this is what we often see in research, right? That we talk to people and they know it's harmful, but still it's normal. This sentence of, well, it's always been done like that, or that's just how things work. So in this report, we've kind of thought about 4 levels of where transformation has to happen. And they're, of course, very interconnected. And these levels are important because they show that transformation is not a single intervention. It's really a multi-layered process. So, of course, not surprising after everything you've heard today, we start with the social norms, right? The expectations that define what a good woman does, what a real man does, who should lead, who should keep quiet, who deserves access, all of these questions. Norm change is slow because it requires collective reflection. It's emotional. It involves fear, pride, identity, social pressure. So all very big emotional topics. And something it involves, and sometimes it also involves losing privilege, right? But without this norm change, every technical approach remains shallow. The next big question, also not surprising, is of course, corruption flourishes where people lack alternatives, right? If you have no access to information, no safe complaint channels, no legal aid, no economic independence, then you don't have the power to resist or expose corruption. This is why gendered inequalities in land, property, income, education, and mobility directly translate into gendered corruption risks, not because women are more moral, but because they're more dependent on gatekeepers. Something that was just touched on as well is the question of knowledge and capabilities, right? And here we talk about something that goes beyond awareness. We often, corruption, anti-corruption work likes awareness raising very much. And of course, this is very important, but we need to go further, right? Because awareness tells you that corruption is wrong. Capability then tells you that you have the right, the legitimacy, and the power to challenge corruption, right? This includes political education, understanding rights, building confidence, and cultivating collective strategies rather than just thinking about individual survival mechanisms. And then last but not least, it's about institutions, right? Because they have written and unwritten rules. The written rules may be gender neutral in an ideal case, but the unwritten rules rarely are, right? And this is about what we all know: who gets promoted, who's protected, whose complaints are taken seriously, all these questions. And transformation here at the institutional level means identifying and shifting both the formal and the informal logic that sustain exclusion and impunity, obviously the informal one being much harder to shift. So taken together, these 4 levels show why gender transformative approaches are not a nice addition to anti-corruption work, but they're really at the core of it, right? And without them, we really risk reinforcing the very inequalities that we're trying to solve. So when we think about this in practice, and we've heard in Paul's presentations are a lot of interesting examples already, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's often about thinking outside of the box, right? It's about being creative. So doing things like visual tools where you draw maps and collective timelines to actually say who is in control, who controls decisions, and where is silence enforced, and using that as an opportunity to open up conversations. There's examples of, groups of men discussing and reflecting on masculinity norms and seeing that, having these enforced is really something that also reinforces corruption and seeing that connection, right? And of course, at the policy level, it's about talking about integrating gender analysis into national integrity frameworks, where, you know, things like naming sexual corruption, redesigning complaint mechanisms, assessing and tracking who actually uses integrity systems, right? And all these changes strengthen credibility because they finally respond to the lived realities, right? So transformation here happens when we work on norms, resources, empowerment, and institutions together, and not when we address them in isolation. And it's really about this addressing power at the center of our work. We, of course, must acknowledge resistance, especially in current times. This is not new, right? Transformation is never neutral. As I said, it redistributes power, legitimacy, and voice. So I would argue that resistance is not a sign of failure, but it's really a sign that the work is touching something real and it's having an effect, right? This is why we really must treat gender transformative work or gender transformative anti-corruption work, as a political project, not just a technical one, right? So what I really would like you to think about is transformation begins when we stop asking women to adjust and start asking to institutions to change, right? So when we think about this in practice, just kind of very quickly a few points, right? First, it means that gender work and anti-corruption work need to stop sitting in separate silos, right? There are two sides in the same challenge, addressing power, legitimacy, and exclusion. It also means that we need to be honest about where our own institutions reproduce norms that protect corrupt practices. It also means that we need to invest in relationships, right, with communities, with norm-setting actors, with men and boys, with women's groups, with LGBTQI actors, and we can expand this, of course, a lot. Norm change is all relational, right? It doesn't happen through directives. It happens through relational exchanges. Fourth, it also means designing accountability tools that reflect the realities of those that are most affected. Think about a reporting mechanism that is unsafe for women. It's not really a reporting mechanism because it's not for everyone. A complaint process that excludes LGBTQ plus people is not a complaint process because it excludes part of the population. And last, and I think this is often hard for all of us, it means being willing to make space for discomfort, because discomfort is often the first sign that norms are being questioned, right? So as we transition into our second set of breakout discussions, I encourage you to carry a few reflections with you when you go in. Think about integrity not only as the absence of corruption, but as the presence of justice, right? Think about gender norms not as this kind of soft tissue that is also there, but as the social structures that organize whose voice counts and whose does not. And think about transformation not as a single intervention, but as everyday work of reshaping how power operates everywhere, in our institutions, in our communities, and in the assumptions we ourselves take for granted. Because ultimately, gender transformative anti-corruption work is about creating systems that reflect the dignity and the rights of everyone. It is not an add-on. It is really the foundation of integrity. So I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Artron. So many great phrases there. Effective anti-corruption is about losing privilege. If you've experienced resistance, that means things might be working. And integrity is the presence of justice. Fantastic points for us to all think about. As before, we're now going to break into two different groups. You can self-select a group with Paul or a group with Artron. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, but also open discussion. It doesn't just have to be questions to the panelists. I believe a pop-up will come up in front of you, and you can select which group you'd like to join. And of course, you can also change the group by going to the breakout sessions, I believe, in the bottom of your, or the top, wherever it appears for you, of your Zoom platform. So there we go. We'll see you in a group. All right, everyone, welcome back. I hope you had a good conversation. I know that we absolutely did and got into some really interesting challenges and concrete things that we've experienced around gender norms and social norms change. That brings us to the end of what I hope for you was a very interesting and relevant conversation. I want to thank each of you for taking the time out of your morning, afternoon, or evening to join us and to participate. And I want to give a special thank you to all of our speakers. and who really graciously gave not just their time, but also sharing their expertise and engaging in this conversation. And of course, every person who came had choices of what they could do with these 2 hours of their day. And so making the choice to join us is just so I'm very grateful that you made that choice. I do hope you can use some of the insights and ideas. And I encourage you, I know we've been on for 2 hours, but I do encourage you when you get off to just pause just for a minute and ask yourself, how do I make use of what we just discussed today? And it can be something as simple as I'm going to pull the 3 key points that were really new, and I'm going to share that at a staff meeting. I'm going to share that at a program team. It could be a little more advanced as I'm going to actually go look at our programmatic theory of change, and I'm going to ask some of these questions. Where might there be norms? Where might there be, who is being silenced? Maybe some of the questions that Ortran put out. Maybe I'm going to ask something around behavior, like Diana went into some of the details of you really getting specific on the different behaviors. And really, are we clear about what behavior we're trying to change through the program that we're actively working on? So I hope that you can take one more minute of your time after you've logged off and think about how might I make use of this discussion today. And if we each take another step forward, we can be continuing to advance not just the gender, but also the innovation in anti-corruption agenda that I think is so important. So with that, I thank you again. I wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good night. And I hope we will see you somewhere in the future.